A species that hadn't walked this land in over 200 years is back, and nobody had to tell them where to go. The Persian fallow deer, known scientifically as Dama mesopotamica, was a native of the biblical landscape of Israel from ancient times, and by the early 1900s, it had been hunted into complete regional extinction. The hills went silent, the forests emptied. An animal that had grazed these lands since before recorded history simply vanished from the map. But that's only the beginning of the story, because what happened next involves a revolution, a spy mission, a blow-dart gun disguised as a walking cane, the last flight out of Tehran, and ultimately, a herd of deer, doing something that no diplomat, no treaty, and no political negotiation has been able to fully accomplish in this region, crossing a heavily guarded border peacefully, on their own terms. Let's go back to where it started. The Persian fallow deer is listed in the Bible as one of the kosher animals, mentioned in Deuteronomy 14:5, and archaeological finds at Carmel prove that its flesh was a common food source in ancient times. This wasn't just a wild animal. It was woven into the fabric of civilizational life in the Middle East for thousands of years. The flesh of the deer was served at King Solomon's table, documented in the Book of Kings. It fed kings. It fed commoners. It was part of the ecosystem and the culture simultaneously. Then human pressure took its toll. The green and forested mountains of the Carmel served as a final refuge for fallow deer until the beginning of the 20th century, when the deer became extinct as a result of deforestation, trees being cut for coal and heat, and due to the use of pesticides. Until about 1920, deer antlers were still available for purchase at markets in Jerusalem and Jordan. That detail alone tells you everything. They weren't gone quietly. They were sold piece by piece until there was nothing left to sell. And then, silence for decades. The species was declared extinct in the wild in 1951. Scientists wrote it off. Conservationists mourned it. The world moved on. But then, just a few years later, something extraordinarily happened. A population of approximately 25 individuals was rediscovered in the Khuzestan province of Iran in 1956. 25 animals. That's it. The entire global population of a species that once ranged from North Africa to Iraq, Turkey, and Iran, reduced to 24 animals clinging to a patch of southwestern Iranian wilderness. Israel paid attention. In 1962, the Israeli government enacted a conservation law to help restore the wildlife population decimated by hunting and wars, and created the Israel Nature and Parks Authority, headed by General Avraham Yoff. Yoff was a six-day war hero, a military man, but he was also a passionate conservationist, and he had a very specific goal: bring the Persian fallow deer back to Israel. What followed was less a conservation effort and more an intelligence operation. Yoff began courting high-ranking Iranian officials. He invited the Shah's brother, Prince Abdul Reza Pahlavi, an avid hunter, to Israel's Negev desert to hunt the rare Nubian ibex. Months later, he arranged another hunting trip for a senior Iranian wildlife official, Rashid Hamsit, who shot an ibex with 53-inch horns, a world record that still stands. All of this hospitality was diplomatic currency, carefully spent toward a single goal: getting those deer. The deal was struck. Then, the Iranian Revolution happened. In 1978, with the stirrings of the Iranian Revolution, the prince agreed to give Israel for fallow deer. When Yoff arrived in Tehran, he suffered a mild heart attack. As he was being airlifted out, he left instructions with General C, the Israeli military attaché in Tehran, to fulfill the mission and bring the deer to Israel. Think about what this means. The country was collapsing into revolution. An Israeli general was in a hospital, and someone still had to go get the deer. Dutch zoologist Dr. Van Grevenbroek, who was in charge of the capture, arrived from Israel armed with a blow-dart gun disguised as a cane, passing burned-out storefronts, burning tires, angry mobs, and the acrid smell of tear gas through Tehran streets. He left the city on a 10-hour drive to a game reserve on the Caspian Sea, where he spent 5 days tracking, capturing and crating for female deer. 5 days in the Iranian wilderness, alone, during a revolution, tranquilizing endangered deer with a dart gun hidden in a walking stick. This is not a nature documentary. This is an espionage thriller that actually happened. On December 8th, the deer were loaded onto the last El Al flight out of Tehran, packed between piles of carpets and the personal effects of Iranian Jews and Israeli officials fleeing the country. For female deer, sedated and crated, sandwiched between the belongings of refugees, on a flight leaving a country on the edge of revolution. They landed in Israel on December 8, 1978, on the eve of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The 4 female fallow deer were airlifted to Israel and placed at the Carmel High Bar Reserve, where they were cared for and bred with males that had been previously transferred from Germany. That original group became the founding population, the genetic nucleus of what would eventually become Israel's entire wild herd. The breeding program worked, slowly, carefully, over years and then decades. In 1996, reintroductions into the wild began at Nahal Kezov Nature Reserve in the Galilee, with releases conducted semi-annually, each batch consisting of 6 to 12 individuals, released from an 11-hectare habituation enclosure. After spending up to 3 months in they didn't just open a gate and wave goodbye. Each cohort of deer spent months inside a large enclosed area, learning the landscape, learning to forage, learning to fear predators before the fence opened and they were on their own. Today, roughly 200 fallow deer live among the green valleys and brush of the western Galilee, the world's largest herd of Persian fallow deer in the wild. Let that sink in. The largest wild population of the species on Earth is now living in Israel's northern forests, descended from 4 females smuggled out of revolutionary Iran on a carpet-laden flight in 1978. In 2020, the Nature and Parks Authority estimated that 200 Persian fallow deer live in the northern Galilee region, while between 90 and 100 live in the Judean hills, and a few others live on Mount Carmel. The reintroduction had spread across 3 distinct ecosystems. 3rd-generation fawns, animals born in the wild. 2 mothers who were themselves born in the wild were now grazing the hills of Jerusalem. The zoological director-in-chief, veterinarian at the Jerusalem Biblical Zoo, called this reintroduction one of the most successful cases of the reintroduction of a species that has become extinct in the wild. And then the deer did something nobody planned for. As the population grew and expanded its range, animals began moving north into the upper Galilee, toward the Lebanese border, toward the Syrian hills. Persian fallow deer were formerly found across Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and eastern Turkey. And by 1875, the range had collapsed entirely to southwestern Iran. The deer don't know about political borders. They never did. They know about food, water, shelter, and the instinct to spread into new territory when the population is healthy enough to sustain it. Younger female Persian fallow deer migrate an average of 2.3 kilometers from their release site, while older females tend to stay within 0.9 kilometers of where they were introduced. Over generations, those distances compound. Each new generation explores a little further than the last. And in a region where Israel's border with Jordan runs along the Jordan River Valley, that exploration eventually led somewhere remarkable. Deer from the growing Israeli herds were documented crossing into Jordanian territory, not captured, not relocated, not part of any formal program. They simply walked across. Animals that hadn't existed in this part of the world for 2 centuries, re-establishing a presence in a country that never asked for them and never expected them. Guided by nothing more than the oldest algorithm on Earth, the search for good habitat. The Persian fallow deer formerly occurred in 8 countries across the Middle East. It is slowly, quietly beginning to reclaim some of that original range, not through human intervention, but through the natural consequence of a population that has grown strong enough to expand. This is what successful conservation looks like when it actually works. It doesn't end with animals in a reserve behind a fence. It ends with animals making their own decisions about where to go next. It ends with the species rewriting its own range map, one careful step at a time, across borders that matter enormously to humans, and not at all to them. The global population of Persian fallow deer has rebounded from only a handful in the 1960s to over 1,000 individuals by the 2010s, from 25 animals hiding in a corner of Iran to 1,000 plus spread across 2 countries, with a third now being quietly colonized by descendants making their own way. The story started with a species erased by deforestation, pesticides, and overhunting gone so completely that markets were selling its antlers like souvenirs of something lost. It continued through espionage, revolution, a faked cane, a cargo hold stuffed with carpets, and decades of painstaking breeding work. And it ended, or rather, it continues with deer walking across a geopolitical border that humans have spent decades arguing over, unbothered and unannounced, simply going home. Nature doesn't need a visa. It just needs enough time and enough space to remember where it belongs.